this has to deal with, well, an article from TruthDig.
Yeah,
From Chris
From
Hedges.
Chris Hedges.
Yes.
Man, Chris Hedges is great. Like,
Right, take it away.
He's just one of those, political orators that just spells it out like it is. And if you want the gist of the entire article, he puts it in the very first sentence. Global finance capital has seized control of the economies of most nation states. That's the reality. That's what's up. We're watching as manufacturing gets shipped to regions of the global south where most workers are paid $1 or less an hour or have no benefits have no benefits. We watch as taxes of the rich corporations get slashed basically to zero. We're privatizing utilities and basic social services, jacking up fees on consumers. And this is a lot of the root of, the unrest and protests that we see in places like Hong Kong, India, Chile, France, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon. And we also see, as a result of this, the rise of right-wing demagogues, false prophets, and he calls out specifically people like Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, and of course, and Modi as well. So finance capital is impervious to political control. That's essentially what he's talking about here. Finance capital is not going to be, quelled in any way by the political class. It's really the opposite. Finance and capital are the masters of the political class. They're the masters of government. In the UK in particular, he calls out Labour and Jeremy Corbyn and their failure to appreciate how desperate workers were for a solution and how they were able to turn to Brexit as a solution, even though it's a terrible solution. It was there offering hope to people. It's misguided, perhaps, not a great direction to go, but he's saying that Labour and specifically Jeremy Corbyn did not adequately make the case that there was an alternative hope that they could trust in. So he points out major corporations and banks, things like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, ExxonMobil, Walmart, Apple, Amazon, are the modern versions of the East India Trading Company. So these and others among today's global corporations, with the assistance of the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund, have created an unassailable monopoly and effectively hollowed out many nation states, both physically and culturally. Governments captive to corporate control have prostituted to transfer wealth upward, swell corporate profits, and crush dissent at the expense of democracy. Professor Anthrax has a super chat for us, and he says, Wesley Wiles.
Nah, let's not be rude to people.
Wesley Wiles says stuff.
All right.
Moving on.
Odd super chat.
Super chat. Thank you for the super chat. He calls out things like COP25, which we talked about on the show yesterday, and sort of how the United States is being called out, and actually large countries in general are being called out by name by protesters on social media for humanitarian crimes, because they are refusing to discontinue the use of fossil fuels and refusing to do anything toward increasing carbon recapture and reduce their carbon footprint, which is going to put countries like Tuvalu underwater in a number of years. He says, he talks about some of the economists in the early part of the 20th century, people like Milton Friedman, Frederick Hayek, and Ayn Rand, and how under their sort of ideas around economics, freedom became equated with the freedom of market forces to do anything the capitalists wanted. That's what freedom meant. Freedom meant freedom of the capital markets. That freedom doomed us and looks set to doom the ecosystem on which we depend for life. He calls out Karl Marx specifically here, not calling out, but he cites Karl Marx specifically here. In Volume 1 of Capital, he explained over a century ago how freedom of the market always results in social inequality. So this alliance with right-wing neo-fascist demagogues such as Trump and Johnson that employ tropes of racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, bigotry, misogyny, that channels the public rage and frustration away from the corporate elites, right, toward vulnerable people. When you have somebody who's in a position of authority telling you that you should be mad at someone who is just another person in the country, right, another marginalized group, a minority group, LGBTQ. That's not the person to be mad at. That's not the person who's keeping wages low. That's not the person who's keeping Americans from having health care. That's not the person who's putting $100 billion in the pockets of Jeff Bezos. That's not your enemy. That's not the person who is benefiting from this corruption. He points out that millions of people in Hong Kong, India, Chile, France, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon understand this, and it's time to join them. I agree with Chris Hedges wholeheartedly. Time to put on our yellow vests. It's time to stand up and resist. So it's things like this. You talk about the Chris Kobach style, like voter purge, right? 300,000 voters removed from the rolls. Daniel, I know you like to say Democrats rig primaries, Republicans rig elections. These elections are undemocratic. The people who are benefiting from this are the people who have been benefiting from this kind of corruption for decades, if not longer. We're in an extreme period of wealth and income inequality, and we are running out of time to save the planet that we all share.
All right.
It is time to stand up and protest. Absolutely go out and vote. We need to vote in massive, massive numbers. But voting may not be enough when there is this much corruption and rigging, and when there is this much malfeasance on the part of our government and it's controlled by its corporate masters. We need to get out into the streets and let our government know this is unacceptable.
Right. Also, real quick, too, I mean, we got to remember this. We don't have a democracy. We have an oligarchy. We have, thanks to money in politics, Citizens United and McCutcheon's decision, where money is speech and corporations are people. Our politicians on both sides of the aisle are bought by the lobby groups, Wall Street, big banks, major corporations, the top 1%. We don't really have a say, and this requires us to step up and get involved. And this is going to be an uphill fight, a continuous uphill fight, because if we think that the establishment is just going to back away, you're wrong. They're going to fight, but remember, there are paper tigers surrounded by a paper wall. If enough of us step up, all of us step up, we can knock that system down and bring in much needed change into our democracy. So we need to make this happen. So know the rules and regulations in your state's primary. Daniel, take it away.
This is one thing I always bring up. The period we live in right now, in about 2020, is very similar to the era of the 1920s. That was when you had Chase, you had your Rockefellers, JP Morgan, you had your Rockefellers, you had your Carnegies, you had this massive amount of concentration of wealth, bringing up East India Company, just another era of that same idea. It seems to be what happens with humanity. It's this kind of wealth gets concentrated, then it gets broken apart, and then it gets reconcentrated, and then gets broken apart. That somehow seems to be this, for less of a better word, a cycle that humanity seems to continue to go through. And what happened when it was that period? Well, you had the boom, you had the Great Depression, you had billionaires, like real, true concentration of wealth to the point that like JP Morgan bailed out the U.S. government. Like that level of concentration, which even though in a sense we're past that, we're also not past that. Right now, we are in that era. We are living 100 years ago today. The same things are happening. The same rules apply. The same balance applies. And what happened back then? Huge amounts of concentration of wealth. Media, much of mainstream media owned yellow journalism, a real thing that they called back then, because of billionaires owning the newspapers, very similar to today. You had governments acting as assistants for corporations, very much like what we have today. You had an indifference to people and their lives and people on the streets and homelessness. And that's one reason Al Capone, as an example, did as well as he did, because he had the soup kitchens and he would give people food, and people were willing to look past just about everything he did because he gave them a warm meal.
Actually, to just add on to that, because when on the 99 Perspective show, Fear and Loathing in the Windy City, myself and my friend Jose, we were talking about Al Capone, and people loved him because he actually took care of people. And yes, he was a criminal. That's without a shadow of a doubt, a violent man. But at the end of the day, look at what he was doing for the people and look at what the government was doing for people at the time.
But the point I'm getting at with that is that you have this basic similar structure. It's different today. The details might be different, but the picture, the structure is the same. It's the same key structure. And what changed everything? It was the Depression. Things will get worse before they get better. We are due for something similar because of the same malfeasance. It's going to happen very much the same as it is in the 30s. And right now, we don't have FDR. We have Bernie Sanders. One thing I've said off air, I think I've said on air on the show a couple times, is that when the Depression hits, we know Sanders has won the race. Because right now, sadly, there are not enough people who are suffering that have power to make it a guarantee. Now it's still up in the air. We think Sanders still has momentum, but when a recession hits, when the recession that we're expecting hits, and I hate to say hopefully it comes soon, because it's going to come eventually, and we already are $100 billion a day bailing out the banks right now. This is where we need to stand up. What we're doing right now, the era that we're in right now, is the most important time of all of our lives. Right now is when we get to determine the future. Now, we have really two choices. One, do we have a future where we get to the point where the billionaires control everything and then we get automation and then they don't need us? And then we're no different from citizens in Saudi Arabia who can be completely excluded because AI is able to take care of everything that they need to take care of? Or are we going to enter the era of great projects? Are we going to fight climate change? Are we going to clean up the ocean? Are we going to have a beautiful planet? Are we going to go into the stars and colonize the planets and space mine? We can do all of these things and more if we win right now, right here, right now. This era that we're in right now, we will look back on 20, 30, 50, 100 years and say this is the most important time to be alive and act. So to quote Kit, are you going to stand on the sidelines, or are you going to get involved? And maybe, as I would say, are you going to design the menu of the future, or are you going to be on it?
Right.
It's your choice.
Paul.
To sort of buttress that point a little bit, get your yellow vests. It's time. And I hate to say it, but in the way that the United States handles protests and the type of response that is absolutely necessary, that we need to be out in the streets demanding, we're going to need more than a yellow vest. We're probably going to also need a flak jacket and a gas mask. So it's my 2 cents.
All right, so real quick on this. Look, we all want a better future. Whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, all of us in this country want a better future. We want to make sure that we have a government that's going to represent us. But for so long, for a very long time, we've been convinced that our vote doesn't matter, that our vote will never really count for anything, and that, well, this is how things are. Well, no, that's not who we are as people. That's not who we are as citizens. We can make a change. We've done that for years. It's in human history where we have actually stepped up to bring in much needed change. If there were never those great pioneers who decided to go ahead and venture out and try new things and actually create something that has been seen before, that is in our blood. That is in our DNA to fight for that better future. We can step up, but it's going to require you guys, all of you, to know that you do matter and that your vote does count, and we got to fight for it. This is our democracy, but right now our democracy is bought. We have an oligarchy. We have a corporate media. You know, we have CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, you name it, continuously to feed us lies. All these corporate media outlets are all the same. Wall Street, big banks, and major corporations can buy our politicians. The RNC and DNC are friends with each other. Never forget, too, that the DNC and Clinton campaign worked together to deny Bernie Sanders the nomination in 2016. Never forget that the Clintons were the ones that helped convince Trump to even run in 2016. They're all friends with each other. They're all friends with each other. They just don't like any of you. So that's the system we have. So now's the time to step up and get involved.